August 17, 1945, Changi Prison, Singapore. 0900 hours. The rain had ceased just 60 minutes before, leaving the heavy air clinging to the skin like damp linen. Steam curled upward from the sun-warmed concrete, and in that haze stood 32 Japanese nurses, silent, weary, their white uniforms turned a pale, grimy gray from 3 punishing days spent crammed into railway wagons. Some gazed forward, expressionless. Others swayed faintly, as though unsure whether they still stood on solid ground. Now imagine yourself in that moment, breathing that dense air, feeling your uniform stick to your back. What would you expect? Lieutenant Akiko Yamamoto, spine straight despite the ache in her limbs, watched as a woman in khaki approached. A British nurse, younger than expected, blonde hair fraying from its pins. Her face was drawn, pale from fatigue, but composed. She stopped 3 measured paces away and began speaking. English, slow and exact. An interpreter relayed her words in flat, mechanical Japanese. You will be examined by medical personnel. Your belongings recorded and returned. You will be assigned living quarters with beds and washing facilities. Akiko stood still, waiting. This, she thought, was the preamble. The real message was yet to come. The vengeance. The reckoning. But nothing followed. The British nurse glanced briefly at the haggard group, then looked back down at her clipboard. There is tea in the canteen, she said. Someone will show you. Tea. Not a fist, not a rifle butt, not a cell. If you've ever wondered what true civilization looks like when standing at the edge of war's abyss, not in its triumph, but in its restraint, stay with us. And if you seek the quiet moments of history that defy expectation, subscribe for more accounts that reveal the other side of the story. These women, nurses of the Imperial Japanese Army, had been taught exactly what to expect. For years, they had absorbed a narrative hammered home by every officer, every pamphlet, every whisper in the field hospitals of Manila, of Rangoon, of the blood-soaked Pacific. Capture by the British meant ruin, brutality, degradation, violation, torture, death, merciful only in that it would end the shame. To surrender was not just dishonor, it was obliteration of self. And then they were offered tea. The canteen was no more than a converted warehouse, rows of long wooden tables beneath mesh-covered windows. The nurses stepped inside slowly, cautiously, as if the very boards beneath their feet might collapse and reveal the trap they still half expected. British orderlies, men in rolled-sleeve uniforms, arms browned by the tropic sun, stood beside metal urns, ladling steaming tea into dented tin mugs. No smiles, no sneers, just the quiet rhythm of protocol. Akiko took a mug, the metal warm in her fingers. The orderly who handed it over didn't meet her eyes. He didn't flinch either. His movements were precise, efficient. He filled the next mug, and then the next. She sat. She drank. It was sharp, tannic, scalding hot, brewed long past the point of delicacy. It was, without exaggeration, the most welcome thing she had tasted in 4 months. Across from her, Raiko Tanaka, another nurse, still gripping her mug with both hands, began to cry. Not the kind of sobbing that draws attention, just quiet tears that slid down her face and vanished into the tea. No one stopped her. No one barked orders. No one mocked the weakness. The orderlies kept pouring, and the line moved on. That tin mug, unadorned and unceremonious, shattered something deeper than fear. Not because it represented kindness, but because it broke from the script entirely. It introduced something alien, not compassion, procedure, order, restraint. What these women encountered wasn't sentiment, it was system. By August 1945, the machinery of the British military administration had processed hundreds of thousands of prisoners across Europe, Africa, and Asia. It wasn't perfect, but it ran, and it ran on protocols refined since the outbreak of war in 1939. Where the Geneva Convention applied, it was followed. Where it didn't, broader codes of military humanity filled the void. Medical care within 24 hours of intake, inventorying personal effects, housing officers, enlisted personnel, and civilians separately. Female prisoners overseen, where possible, by female staff. This wasn't mercy, it was policy, and that made it all the more remarkable. Restraint was not sentiment, it was strategy. Imagine this: you are newly arrived in an enemy camp, a prisoner of war. You brace yourself for degradation, for hunger, for pain, but instead you are handed a work schedule, a meal plan, a clean bed, and, perhaps most shockingly, a set of rules written in your language. It wasn't kindness, it was design. At British-run POW facilities, work assignments were tied directly to food rations, a fair exchange. Productive labor was encouraged, yes, but not demanded at the cost of health or dignity. This wasn't about breaking spirits. It was about keeping the machine running efficiently. Camps run with structure and security meant fewer escape attempts, which meant fewer guards, fewer bullets, fewer enemies created. And then there was intelligence. From those willing to speak, humane treatment yielded better information than threats ever could. Soft power, not brute force. Diplomacy played its role as well. The eyes of the Red Cross meant every camp became a stage, and every policy a message. We hold the moral ground. Do you? Because somewhere Allied prisoners languished in Axis hands, and their survival might one day depend on the standard upheld here. This wasn't morality in the warm, fuzzy sense. It was colder, sharper. The understanding that civilization only remains intact when its principles don't buckle under pressure, not when it's easy to be noble, but precisely when it's hard. Between 1943 and 1945, the average mortality rate for Japanese prisoners held in British camps was under 2%. Think about that. Far below combat losses, and staggeringly lower than what Allied prisoners experienced when the roles were reversed. By 1944, Red Cross reports confirmed it. Caloric intake met or exceeded minimum thresholds. Work programs were capped at 8-hour shifts. Sundays, reserved for rest or worship. No, this wasn't mercy, it was method. And for the women who had braced for cruelty, what they encountered instead was a system. Cool, bureaucratic, but unmistakably functional. Processing began. 4 hours, start to finish. Each woman was called forward one by one. An interpreter, an older Singaporean Chinese man with perfect Japanese, walked them through what would happen calmly and without flourish. First, the medical examination, tuberculosis screening, checks for tropical diseases, all wounds recorded. A British female doctor performed the assessments with a nurse assisting. The process was swift, professional, and free of unnecessary contact. Next came the inventory of personal belongings. Each item carefully recorded on pre-printed forms. Wedding bands, family photographs, Buddhist prayer beads. Everything tagged, sealed in envelopes marked with numbers. Nurse Michiko Sato, who had carried a small jade Buddha with her for 6 long years, watched as a British clerk wrote, "Religious item, jade." He scribbled down 4 scimitarmatons, her transliterated name, slid the statue into an envelope, sealed it, and handed her a receipt. "You'll get it back when you leave," the interpreter said gently. She nodded, folded the slip, and tucked it into her breast pocket. Then came the barracks assignment. Block C, Wing 2, 20 women per room. Metal frame beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and a mosquito net. At the hallway's end, shared wash basins. The walls were whitewashed, the floor swept bare concrete. On the door, a notice in Japanese and English: roll call 700 hours, meals, 800, 1300, 1900 hours, work. Voluntary, schedule, posted weekly mail. 1 letter per fortnight, subject to censorship. Medical officer, available daily, 900, 1200 conduct. Respect required of all personnel. That night, the first meal arrived. Bowls of rice, salted fish, boiled vegetables, a heel of bread on the side. The portions weren't large, but they were enough. Some women ate hurriedly, hunched over like scavengers guarding their scraps. Others ate with painful deliberation. Every bite a test for betrayal, poison, punishment. But none came. Nurse Tanaka, the same woman who had wept silently over her tea, finished her meal, lowered her spoon, folded her hands, and began to cry again. This time she was not alone. Several others followed, not out of fear, but from the unbearable release of it. By the second week, a rhythm emerged. Most of the women volunteered for work, not out of obligation, but because boredom gnaws at the mind and structure offers sanctuary. They were assigned to clerical duties, light agricultural labor, or to the laundry unit servicing the camp hospital. The shifts were 8 hours. Supervision was sparse. The laundry detail was led by Sergeant Margaret Collins of the Australian Army Nursing Corps. She was 43 with tightly bound red hair and a direct, no-nonsense tone. Her words came clipped, efficient, and the interpreter echoed them without flourish. "You fold the sheets like this. Corners square, stack them here. If you don't know, ask." She demonstrated once, then walked away. The work was steady, repetitive, almost meditative. They washed and folded linens destined for hospital beds, where British and Australian soldiers lay recovering from wounds, from malaria, from dysentery that refused to leave the body. And then, one afternoon, something quietly profound happened. Lieutenant Akiko Yamamoto found herself folding sheets beside a young British nurse named Evans. Fair-skinned, soft-voiced, Welsh. Her accent gave the interpreter trouble, but her hands moved in rhythm, folding corners with silent precision. No words were exchanged, not yet, but the distance had narrowed. The first thread of recognition, not as enemies, but as nurses, had begun. It began not with an apology, but with a glance. Evans, the young British nurse with the Welsh lilt, folded another sheet with practiced ease. Then, as if speaking more to the linen than to her companion, she murmured, "You're good at this." Akiko heard her. The words were plain, offered without flourish. She didn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure if responding was permitted, if it would be misunderstood, if it would be held against her. Evans didn't press. She simply kept folding. A moment later, she added softly, "My brother was captured in Hong Kong. I hope someone's treating him decent." Then she moved to the next table. It wasn't a conversation, and it wasn't forgiveness, but it was something undeniably human. Life at the camp settled into a rhythm. Beyond the laundry rooms and hospital wards, the vegetable plots behind the wire fence began to thrive. Neat rows of tomatoes, beans, bitter greens rising under the tropical sun. For the women who tended them, these rows became quiet testaments to usefulness, to pride. Michiko Sato, who had grown up on a farm near Hiroshima, found solace in the soil. She stayed late some evenings, pulling weeds, checking irrigation lines, coaxing green from the brown earth. One night, when the first tomatoes made it into the evening stew, she said nothing. But the next day, an extra piece of bread appeared beside her tray. No fanfare, no explanation, just the ration, placed gently by an orderly who moved on without a word. Not charity, not reward, reciprocity. Then came October, a new chapter. 12 of the nurses, volunteers, were transferred to a rehabilitation facility in northern Malaya. There they would assist in a civilian hospital treating local populations shattered by the war. The British commandant made the terms crystal clear. This was voluntary, and any misconduct meant immediate return to Changi. None chose to leave. The hospital was understaffed. The patients, Malay, Chinese, Tamil, carried the scars of occupation, starvation, and disease. The British and Australian doctors, already pushed to their limits, worked 20-hour shifts in a desperate battle against cholera, typhus, and the silent toll of long deprivation. The Japanese nurses joined them. At first, they were unwelcome. Civilians turned away. One Chinese grandmother spat at Akiko's feet when she offered fresh bandages. An elderly Malay man turned his face to the wall as she approached. Captain Hennessy, the British doctor overseeing the ward, intervened just once. "She's here to help," he said to the man in Malay. "You don't have to accept it, but she's not leaving." Akiko said nothing. She cleaned the wound, changed the dressing, and left. The next day, the man did not turn his face. By December, Akiko was assisting in surgeries. 12-hour shifts blurred into one another. On one such evening, After extracting jagged shrapnel from a child's leg, she peeled off her gloves, aching to the bone. Captain Hennessy handed her a tin mug, filled with the same bitter, oversteeped tea served back at Changi. He looked her in the eye. "You did good work today." She hesitated, then bowed lightly. "Don't bow," he said, not unkindly. "Just say thank you." Akiko straightened. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, turned, and walked away. That mug, plain, hot, no different from the others, would become a symbol. A quiet, heavy one. Not of compassion, not of forgiveness, but of something deeper. Recognition. The idea that competence and decency could still cross the scorched space between enemies. Back at Changi, the hospital treated everyone. British troops, Australian POWs who had survived Japanese captivity, gaunt and ghost-like, civilians ravaged by neglect, and yes, even Japanese prisoners. Illness made no distinction. Neither did the medical staff. In September, Nurse Raiko Tanaka, the one who had wept into her tea that first day, came down with dengue fever. Fever raged, joints screamed, delirium gripped her. She was moved to the isolation ward, no different from any other patient. Her attending physician, Dr. Whitman, a 60-year-old veteran of the Boer War, never said more than medically necessary, but he checked her temperature twice daily, adjusted her quinine dose, made sure fluids were given regularly. There was no warmth, but there was care, precision, commitment. When she recovered 3 weeks later, fragile, trembling, she returned to her barracks. Her bed was still there, untouched, her belongings undisturbed. The mortality rate for Japanese POWs in British custody never rose above 2%. That number was no accident. It was upheld by policy, by officers who viewed the Hippocratic Oath not as an option, but as a binding truth. Even in war, even for the enemy, not sentiment, standards, and those standards had consequences. By early 1946, something had shifted, deep inside. One evening, Akiko sat alone at a wooden table in the canteen, the same building where tea was first served, pen in hand, writing her second letter home. She knew the censor would read it. Still, the truth on the page was simple. "I am treated fairly. I have work. I am not harmed. The propaganda we believed was false." She paused, her pen hovering. A quiet question formed, one she hadn't dared to consider before. If what we were told about capture was a lie, what else might be untrue? The thought came softly, not with a crash, not in defiance, but like water sliding through a crack in a stone. Slow, patient, inevitable. Decades later, in an interview with a Japanese historian in 1982, Akiko would reflect, "I expected to die with honor. Instead, I learned that honor is not always where we are told to find it. The British did not have to treat us well, but they did. They chose to. That simple truth, that British personnel chose restraint over revenge, would echo louder in Akiko Yamamoto's memory than any act of violence ever could. It was a truth that didn't come with a trumpet blast or a sudden revelation. It arrived slowly, uncomfortably, but undeniably, and it spread, in whispers exchanged over meals, in letters home carefully worded and cautiously hopeful, in silent moments when nurses sat with their tin mugs and stared at their reflections in the cooling tea, wondering, what else have we been wrong about? If you're finding value in these overlooked chapters of history, stories where discipline triumphed over hatred, where policy outweighed vengeance, consider subscribing. We're not here to tell the easy story. We're here to tell the full one. By March 1946, the rules began to bend. Women who had earned the trust of their overseers were granted limited freedom of movement within designated camp zones. Some assisted in administration, translating captured documents, helping process repatriation files. Michiko Sato, the quiet farmer's daughter who had tended the vegetable plots, was given a new post, caretaker of the camp greenhouse. No guards, no supervision, just a task, and the quiet expectation that she would fulfill it. She did. When a storm shattered part of the glass roof, she worked through the night with 2 British engineers to cover the seedlings and repair the structure. The plants lived, The next week, the commandant issued a requisition for new tools. A notice was posted, commending her work. It wasn't sentiment, it was something more resilient, earned respect. In April, a new assignment found Akiko. Sergeant Barrow, the same gruff but fair Australian she had come to recognize, approached her after a laundry shift. "Doc Hennessy wants you for the surgical ward," he said. "If you're willing." "I am," she replied. Barrow nodded. "Good. You start Monday. Oh, 700. He turned to go, then hesitated. "The work's hard," he added, "but you've been reliable. That counts." It was the closest thing to a compliment Akiko had received in 2 years, and it mattered more than she expected. Then came Christmas. Not a spectacle, not a celebration, but a moment. The camp chaplain, Reverend Thomas, a gentle-voiced Anglican with the weariness of a long war behind his eyes, organized a voluntary service in the assembly hall. The invitation was extended to all prisoners, regardless of belief. 15 Japanese nurses came, not out of piety, not out of curiosity, but perhaps in part because they sensed that something significant might happen. The service was quiet, hymns in English, a reading from the Gospel of Luke, a homily on peace and reconciliation, translated with careful precision by the interpreter. At the end, Reverend Thomas brought out a tin of biscuits and a box of Red Cross cigarettes. "These are gifts," he said, "in the spirit of the season, no strings." And then, perhaps for the first time, British soldiers, Australian staff, and Japanese prisoners sat side by side, accepting what was offered. Akiko took a biscuit and a cigarette, though she didn't smoke. Back in the barracks, she split the biscuit with Nurse Tanaka. They sat in silence on their bunks, listening to the steady rhythm of rain on tin. Not understanding, not conversion, but something more fragile, more powerful, recognition. That even here, a shared humanity could flicker into life. The letters continued, every word inspected, every phrase approved, but they were sent. In January 1946, Michiko Sato wrote home, "I am in a British camp. I am not harmed. The food is plain, but sufficient. I work in a garden. The soldiers do not mistreat us. I do not know when I will come home, but I am alive. Tell Mother I am alive." The censor stamped it. The letter went through. Weeks later, responses began to arrive. Letters filled with disbelief, trembling with relief. One came to Akiko from her mother in Osaka. It contained a single line that shattered the silence. "We were told all prisoners were executed. I prayed you had died quickly. To know you are treated with decency, I do not understand this war anymore." That sentence, written by a woman who had believed it all, revealed the true consequence of restraint. Every letter that arrived home disrupted the myth. Every returning prisoner who spoke the truth broke the cycle. Civilization's power, it turned out, wasn't found in the gun. It was in the letter that told the truth. Then came the test. In February 1946, a new British guard, Private Dawson, just 20, fresh from London, lost his temper during morning roll call. A Japanese nurse had miscounted. Confusion followed. Dawson snapped. He shoved her, shouted, used a word that didn't require translation. The woman stumbled, but she didn't fall. Sergeant Barrow was there in moments. "Dawson, outside, now." The next morning, Dawson was gone, transferred out of the POW division. That afternoon, the commandant addressed the camp through the interpreter. Every prisoner was present. "Private Dawson has been removed from duty. He will face disciplinary action. His behavior does not reflect the standards of this camp or this army. You are prisoners, but you are treated by regulation." That moment didn't erase the incident, but it reinforced the line in the sand and the integrity of those who enforced it. This is what strength looked like, not brutality, not domination, but the will to uphold a principle, even when no one was watching, even when the enemy was powerless. Because the measure of civilization is not how it treats the obedient, but how it holds fast under pressure, when anger would be easy, when revenge would be justified, and chooses something better. Any violation of those regulations by staff will be addressed immediately. That was the message from the commandant. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The statement rang louder in its calm certainty than any punishment could have. That same afternoon, the woman at the center of the incident, Nurse Fujimoto, was summoned to the commandant's office. She went expecting blame. The miscount had caused confusion. She assumed consequences would follow. Instead, the commandant looked her in the eye and said simply, "That soldier's behavior was unacceptable. It will not happen again." She bowed, uncertain how to respond, and was dismissed. The message was unmistakable. The wire around the camp was the punishment. Everything within it would be governed by rules, not rage. By July 1946, the gates began to open. Repatriation ships waited in harbor, and the first departures were underway. Most of the nurses, their belongings neatly tagged, their emotions less so, boarded ships bound for a country they barely recognized. They returned to Japan carrying more than what they had brought. They carried contradictions, a homeland in ruins, streets lined with ash and silence, and a truth that did not fit neatly into the narratives people back home wanted to hear. Some were met with suspicion, others with bitterness, few with understanding. But not all left. 12 stayed. Among them was Akiko Yamamoto. They remained behind in Malaya and Singapore, not for the British Empire, not for allegiance, but for something deeper, purpose, skill, and the dawning realization that the borders drawn by propaganda were always more fragile than promised. The need was immense. Hospitals still overflowed. Disease didn't care who had surrendered and who had conquered. And these women, trained, tested, and tempered by experience, were needed. By 1948, most had finally returned home. A handful didn't. Some married local men. Others opened small clinics in rural villages, quietly dedicating their lives to healing where destruction had once reigned. Akiko returned to Japan in 1949. She worked as a nurse in Yokohama for 3 decades. Never married, and quietly she maintained a correspondence with Captain Hennessy until his death in 1973. The letters were rare, reserved, written with the formal tone of 2 professionals. They discussed medicine, books, occasionally the weather. They never discussed the war. But the shadow of it stretched across every line. In her final letter to him, dated 1972, she wrote, "You taught me that strength is not in cruelty. That is a lesson I have never forgotten." And it began, as so many things did, with that mug of tea, not as a gesture of kindness, but as a manifestation of restraint, discipline dressed in the plain clothes of decency, a system choosing standards over vengeance, even when vengeance would have been easier, even when vengeance would have felt justified. Those women had stepped off the railway trucks expecting beatings, expecting degradation, expecting to be shown the face of the enemy as they had always been told to imagine it, savage, merciless, brutal. Instead, they were handed tea. And in that moment, the most unsettling thing of all happened. They were forced to look in a mirror and ask, what if everything we were told about honor, about strength, about civilization was wrong? Because the truth is this: strength is not the ability to destroy. Every nation at war has proven it can kill. True strength lies in choosing not to, when the opportunity to do so is right there. The British didn't treat Japanese POWs well because they were weak. They did it because they were strong enough not to become what they had fought against. That is the power of standards, of discipline, of civilization, not in its comfort, but under pressure, when the world burns and the enemy is before you, and you still choose rules over revenge. That's the definition of victory, not the flags in the street, but the camp with barbed wire, where the prisoner was given back her belongings, not stripped of her dignity. Where a woman expected a bullet and received tea, the lesson was brutal and simple. The side that holds its standards when it doesn't have to is the side that gets to define what victory means. If these stories matter to you, the ones history forgets because they are too complicated, too uncomfortable, too revealing, consider subscribing. We're committed to telling them right. That tin mug, passed hand to hand in camps from Europe to Asia, became a symbol, not of mercy, but of moral resolve. It didn't taste sweet. It wasn't shared with a smile. It was bitter, scalding, and utterly unforgettable. Because that is how civilization is proved. Not in parades, but in the quiet act of offering tea to someone who had been taught you would shoot them, and in doing so, revealing that the real lie of war is that strength and cruelty are the same thing. They never were. They never will be.